Hey y'all! Welcome back to another episode of the OCD Family Podcast. We are continuing with part two of our series with the incomparable Dr. Jonathan Abramowitz, where we will be discussing the impact of OCD in couples. I don't know about you all, but part one was so helpful in setting up a framework for understanding OCD, understanding what accommodation truly entails, and exploring the support and resources available to the family system. If you missed part one, it's definitely worth a listen. And in typical OCD family style, we are going to build off of that rich foundation. Also, head on over to ocdfamilypodcast.com and look for this episode's podcast for more information on Jon, his publications, his website, and learning more about the dynamic work he is doing. And in case you're new to these parts, here's a little bit more about me as well. I'm Nicole Morris, licensed marriage and family therapist and mental health correspondent. And let me be the first to say, welcome to the family. The OCD family, that is. I am here to create a community of support for family members, spouses, partners, parents, adult children, as there may be adult words, and chosen family of OCD sufferers and their community. I've had over 22 years of experience in the mental health field, but please note that this information does not qualify or substitute as a diagnostic evaluation, therapy, or treatment, and it is presented on an as-is basis. Please follow up with a qualified mental health provider in your area regarding concerns for yourself or loved ones. Thank you for joining us today. Now, let's get started. I am talking with Dr. Jonathan Abramowitz today. He's on the East Coast here in the States. He is working out of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He also has a private practice. He has so many very, very helpful books, but the book that we've talked about the most, The Family Guide to Getting Over OCD, is so perfect for our community. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And thank you. Thanks for all that you've contributed to the field as well as your time with our community. I really appreciate it.
Likewise, my pleasure.
So this is a great opportunity to launch into talking about the complex, complicated dynamics that emerge in dating and also in marriage or partnership, these more intimate relationships. Because within the family setting, there is a little more of that power authoritative difference where, especially for children when they're 18 and under. But for spouses, that dynamic can play out. I think there's more information for families out there than for couples. In therapy, they can get a lot of support. But just going, oh, OCD in couples, you can find relationship OCD information, which may be at play, but how to support that in the marriage or partnership. Can we talk a little bit about, first of all, some of the differences that you might experience in this, the changes, the shifts, because perhaps you even have had an experience of OCD in the family system, but now you're dating somebody with OCD or you're married and you're impacted by that. How could you help somebody conceptualize some of the differences that kind of grow and blossom when you are going into those intimate relationships?
Yeah. Well, so when you're in an intimate relationship with someone, then a part of that relationship is taking care of them, right? When you love them, you want to do what you can for them to make them happy.
Mhm.
And when the person has OCD, it can be really tricky because do I make them happy by relieving their distress here in the moment when they're anxious about did I leave the door unlocked and they're begging you to go down and check when you're tired and half asleep, at night, right? So I
Right.
can I can do that for my partner and make them feel better right there in the moment. And that seems like a loving thing to do.
Mhm.
But that's in the long run, that's just encouraging the OCD symptoms because that pattern will continue, right? My partner is going to continue to ask me to do that because it works. It makes them feel better. It makes them feel reassured.
Mhm.
Mm, Then on the flip side, what I would say is the most loving thing to do is to help your partner to learn, that they don't need that reassurance, but that's something that in order to do that, you have to say to your partner, I love you and I realize that you're anxious, but I'm not going to check for you anymore because that's only making the OCD worse. And because I love you, I want to help you get over the OCD. Right. But then that can lead to arguments. And, that's where couples based OCD treatment comes in, where the therapist has the opportunity to educate both partners and get everyone on the same page so that that person with OCD understands that what their loved one without OCD doing really is a loving thing, even though it's kind of that tough love. And I'm not a big fan of that expression, tough love, but I think people can relate to that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of the couples, so this is where it can get a little tricky sometimes because, say, you're coming in and you're having struggles with your spouse or your partner, and you don't even realize it's OCD. And if you happen to luck out and go to a therapist that you're talking and they go, oh, that sounds like there's some OCD at play. This can be challenging because, first of all, going home and going, so my therapist said you have OCD. That usually doesn't go over well. Secondly, there may be some resistance at times coming in and having some of that psychoeducation and that support because, well, you're this person's therapist and you've already judged me coming in and I don't, these are some common problems that we face with couples in general that can happen. But also within OCD, especially if neither partner realized OCD was at play, maybe you were very aware anxiety lived in the relationship, but never realized it was OCD. That learning curve, both for the sufferer and for the partner, can be pretty big. And it can be a challenge for both parties to buy in or be on the same page about that.
Agreed. Yep. Fortunately, many couples are on the same page and many couples do recognize that, this is OCD. More and more, I think OCD is becoming, recognized in our culture. People know what it is. Although I should go back on that just a little bit because I think there are a lot of people that, think things are OCD that really aren't. But I think
Right.
still, compared to maybe 20, 30 years ago, many more people understand OCD. And in our work, and we've done research on this at the University of North Carolina, most couples are interested in learning how to work together.
Yeah.
That said, we did see some couples that just could not
Hmm.
get their act together to be on the same team around this, whether it was the partner without OCD who just had to use that logic and, kind of try to talk their loved one into it or would get really frustrated and couldn't contain their emotions, or the person with OCD that just refused to see it any other way. And it's my way or the highway. And,
Hmm.
but for the most part, we find that when we're able to help them communicate with one another and express their thoughts and feelings tactfully to one another, it can be done where we can get folks on the same page and working together. And it's often a very rewarding experience for both partners and a growing experience and a together experience where they learn, that they can manage as a team, they can overcome, really big barriers. And we've seen that in couples where they have really that's something that their relationship just kind of builds from there, but it's not everybody.
It's not everybody, but I think that's a great point. And if you have somebody that walked into your office, I mean, getting to that point, the chances are they're not completely refusing because that takes a lot
Right.
to get them to walk into that office or even in a telehealth setting to sync up into that meeting. It takes a lot of vulnerability and it's not easy in any situation when you're coming. A lot of people come into therapy in kind of that reactive state of this is how everything has hit the fan and this is kind of our last step before I don't know what. And so having them come in there, usually there is a lot of motivation. Let's talk about accommodation and how that shows up in couples because you talked about it a little bit with can you go check this, make sure I did shut the door, lock the door, an accommodation of that sort. Sometimes too, there's that discussion that partners can do so well. So it could be, I'm trying to talk to you about something, and the partner says, I'm not going to accommodate your OCD. And the OCD sufferer says, I'm not. this isn't my OCD. This is me saying this. And they're like, no, you want reassurance. You're not doing your homework. What would you say in terms of helping both of these partners learn about accommodation and communicating about and around the OCD? Because not everything is OCD, and we need to validate that. There's life outside of OCD. That's the point. We want to be able to live to those values.
Yeah. One of the things that we teach early on in couples therapy for OCD is how partners should share their thoughts and feelings with one another. So very often when OCD comes up in for a couple, the urge is for the partners to try to solve the problem, to jump in. The person without OCD wants to try to tell the person with OCD what they should do, what they shouldn't do.
Mhm,
Person with OCD wants to tell the other person what they should do.
mhm,
And instead, the first thing we want to do is help them to just share their thoughts and feelings. This is what it's like for me. This is what I'm experiencing right now.
mhm,
And then the other partner to kind of listen and actively listen and say, oh, I get it. You're going through this. And just because, by the way, just because you hear what the other person is saying doesn't mean you have to agree. So the person
right.
without OCD might not agree that the floor is deadly to eat a piece of a grape off the floor, for example. But to their partner, it seems deadly. And so at least to put yourself in their shoes and say, okay, I get it for you. This is really scary. You're really scared right now.
Mhm,
And similarly, for the person with OCD, to hear their partner out and say, I get it. You're really frustrated right now about this OCD, right? So if I'm the non OCD partner, I might say to my loved one with OCD, hey, this whole OCD thing, this is really frustrating for me. I feel like this is getting in the way and causing all these kinds of problems. And then the person with OCD says, I get it. This is really frustrating for you. And the idea is just for the couple to share their thoughts with each other, share their feelings with each other so that they can at least understand what the other person is going through. And it turns out that when we teach couples how to do that, that helps to get them on the same page
mhm.
for how to start to move forward using exposure and response prevention.
We talked in part one about the parents getting caught in this guilt cycle. And I think when you come down to it too, in the partners, when that defensiveness rises up and it's no, this isn't the way it went. No, this is what you said. I think in that or that desire to solve, I think there is sometimes that underlining guilt. Am I at fault here? Did I do something to make your OCD worse? Or is this ever gonna be different? And what have I done to contribute to that? How, maybe I have just accommodated, and getting stuck in that guilt cycle certainly can come up. I think it often, when we're talking about conflict resolution, people's sense of responsibility and where did I maybe mess up? And it's vulnerable to say that. And now I feel anxious and I don't know how to handle this distress. That can really go to the root of a lot of the different conflicts. And so, especially within OCD, when OCD is a third kind of party in your private relationship here, it can get pretty crowded. And so, being able to actively listen, I think that was a really important point. And that's a hard thing to do even if OCD is not in the picture, to have your spouse go, "Hey, I'm upset because this, and it made me feel like that," and you just to be like, "Yeah, I
Right.
hear you," and not be like,
As
"But that's not what I meant."
as human beings,
Mhm.
that's what we do. We figure out problems and we try to solve them.
Right.
And but that's and that can be really helpful if you're trying to figure out childcare or finances or how to manage, you know, whatever, in-laws and things like that. But
Right.
when it comes to dealing with, emotional difficulties like OCD, the first step is to be able to listen, understand what the person's going through.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And for that to be mutual, not just
Yeah.
you as the care support, as the spouse, as the lover going, "Okay, I'll hear you." It's also asserting yourself and saying, "Hey, I'm needs in this too."
That's exactly right.
Y
Yep, my grandmother I used to always say, it's a two-way street, right? Relationships are a two-way street, and it's very true. And OCD affects and can be really frustrating for both partners,
Yeah.
and they we want to teach them how to listen to each other.
Right, and if it were to be a one-way street indefinitely, you're gonna build a lot of resentment, right?
Yeah,
You're gonna be like,
it
I'm no. And I think that's something that where we can get caught up in the family example, like we were talking about in part 1, because we go, "Yeah, it's a two-way street, but I'm the parent, so I should be taking care of them." So it's like, "Oh, it's kinda one way." And it's like, "No, it's a reciprocal relationship." There is a different
it's different.
dynamic,
It's different. It's still a two-way street,
but
but
it's yeah.
it is different. That's and, the parent, especially if it's a younger child, yeah, the parent is very much in the driver's seat. Maybe it's a little bit more of a one-way street when it's a younger child, but yeah, for a adolescent, teenager, and certainly adult child, um, it is a two-way street, although when one of the things that I talk about in the book, and one of the things that I help parents to understand, even parents of adult children,
Mhm,
which is not this is not the case in couples,
mhm.
right? But when it's a parent, you've got leverage, right? When the person with OCD depends on you for something, even if it's an adult and they depend on you for accommodation or for, finances or things like that, it's important to understand where you have that leverage and to be able to, use that in a respectful way to get what you want. Couples should not do that. That is the that is the sign of a
An
not a
abusive
good
relation yeah.
relationship.
It can be
Right, there's
it's
manipulation
it's
going on if that's
dicey
the case.
very quickly. Yeah,
Yes.
but that's a great point because then you have situations where you might have serial relationships like, "Okay, that didn't work out, so I'm leaving." And I go into this new relationship, "Okay, that didn't work out, I'm leaving, I'm going into this new relationship." And can you prevent that? I think a lot of concerns that I'll hear from couples are, "Well, what if this ends in divorce? Because 'Cause I'm really upset and a little bit resentful about how things are right now, but I don't want it to end in divorce, and if I say something, they're gonna leave me." That is one of the big fears. Also, sometimes we run into this situation where someone will be very upset if you don't accommodate what I need. I don't think I can live. And if you leave me, I don't think I can live without you. And so there starts to be this fear of, well, they're kind of suicidal. And if I don't accommodate, they're going to hurt themselves. And then that's on me. And I can't live with myself if that happens. Can we speak to that dynamic? Because it shows up in families as well, especially with teens, but even sometimes younger people would be surprised to know. But also, this can definitely happen in partner relationships. So, can we speak to that a little bit of what to do? I mean, you provide some great examples in the book, but what to do when someone's like, "Okay, if you don't help me here, I'm going to hurt myself."
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that these kinds of situations require a therapist
Mhm.
to be able to intervene and to teach first it's communication skills. And there are fair and unfair ways for couples to communicate to each other, and the messages that couples, that we want couples, members of couples, to send to one another. And so learning how to express those feelings in healthy ways so that, those kinds of things are less likely to happen. There's less of that. But we also want to take those kinds of things seriously. And if you have a partner or a child or adult who is making these kinds of threats, we need to take them seriously.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean giving in.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean, allowing yourself to be kind of run off your game in terms of not accommodating. You can still not accommodate, and the person can still, express thoughts about harming themselves. But there are things that you can do. For example, one good way of helping the person learn how to manage these kinds of, whether it's they become so anxious and they start to make threats about harming themselves, suicide, things like that, is to call 911
Yeah,
when that comes up. I love you. And as much as I love you, I can't let this go
right.
without doing something about it. And I don't know, I'm not a mental health professional. I don't know how to deal with this. So I'm going to call 911, or we're going to go to the emergency room, and we're going to let the professionals deal with this. And what that does is it does two things. It sends a message, I love you and I care about you, right? And I'm
Mhm.
going to respond when you talk about harming yourself.
Right.
But it also sends the message of, if I talk about suicide, it's not going to be fun. I'm
Right.
having 911, having the police show up and all that. That is not a fun experience. And going to the emergency room, waiting around, having an evaluation, that's not a fun experience either. So it doesn't reward
Right.
talking about suicide by giving in and, okay, if you say suicide, then I'll accommodate for you.
Right.
Um, right?
Yes.
And I think that that's a way to thread the needle where
Mhm.
you're showing that you care and you're attending to what they're saying, but you're also not giving in.
Right.
And again, I think that's a very loving thing to do.
Very, very loving. I mean, their safety is number one. And if it gets to that level, even if you're like, I don't know if they're threatening that, would they really do it? Well, err on the side of caution.
Err on the side of caution.
Say,
You're not in most cases, you're not a mental health professional, so you
right,
can't make that call. And, it would be terrible to say, you're just bluffing, there's the window, right?
right,
God forbid. At the
right.
same time, if they are bluffing, then you're giving in and you're just doing the accommodating, and that's just reinforcing the bluffing.
Right. And speaking of that, I think the other important piece is if you say and you make this clear, if somebody we're not punishing anybody for saying if they are thinking suicidal thoughts. I think it's a huge strength, and it takes incredible strength and courage for somebody to say that. So we're going to take it seriously.
We're
And
gonna
if
take
they weren't, they're going to learn like, boy, that was not worth that. I don't want to do that because they're going to really react to that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You said it very well, Nicole. That's exactly right.
But it's also important that you fall through if you say you're gonna do that, because sometimes we run into this situation where it's like, "Hey, if you're gonna say that, I'll just take you to the hospital right now." No, 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 no. But then the next time they say it and they're like, "Oh, no," and they accommodate. Like, take them to the hospital. Take them.
Follow through
Follow
follow
through.
through is very, not only with this, but really
Right.
with any of the stuff that we're talking about. If you and again, that's another thing that I see a lot as an obstacle for partners, parents to be successful, with managing situations like this, is that they'll say one thing and they'll do something else. And that just sends the message to the person with OCD. Oh, I don't need to take them seriously. If
Mhm.
I just kind of up the ante enough, I'll
Mhm.
I'll get what I want. And again, that doesn't help the situation at all. So you
Right.
want to be, and I talk about this in the book, you want to plan very carefully, meticulously what you're gonna do,
Mhm.
how you're gonna do it, so that when the situation arises, you are ready for action and you're not just, talking.
Yeah, that's a really great point because we can think of how this happens with children and parents too, how the ante can get upped, in situations, particularly as the children get older and more knowledgeable and feel like, hey, I understand everything now. You can get into these back and forths, but especially with partners that Annie, well, we can keep challenging each other and kind of huffing up our chest and puffing up. And it can get to places where, afterwards, most people are like, oh gosh, like that just got out of control quickly. And so we think about that in the best cases when conflict can get out of hand. Now we add, like you said, with OCD, this is like life or death level of threat for the OCD sufferer.
Yeah.
So if they were going to if they were going to go to town on something that didn't even really matter over here, imagine how much more convicted they're going to be if they really fear. And they do. They really fear. They're not making that up. They really fear.
And I think that's a really important point that, we can say, they're bluffing or whatever, but really it's important for folks to remember that when someone with OCD gets really upset, when they talk about self-harm, when they talk about, you don't love me and all this kind of thing, that is driven by fear, like you're saying, that is driven by anxiety. And it is all about trying to get that feeling of safety that OCD makes them crave so much. And
Mhm.
people are capable of doing all sorts of things in that fight or flight kind of moment where they feel like, yeah, this is a crucial, desperate situation.
Yeah, and you think about, like, the stress responses happening in the brain. I'm sure we've all heard these stories from time to time where, somebody will be in a really, really dire situation and they are overcome in the moment and they're able to somehow masterfully get through a situation because they have so much cortisol pumping. And how did they even do this? And their adrenaline's going. And it's like that is constant
Yeah,
for the OCD sufferer. And so they're going to be a little more irritable because they're constantly taxed by this. You're more irritable because you have been living with this third party in the relationship as well. And
right.
so recognizing, and this is where I do think in treatment, it can be really, really healing just to realize, hey, we're on the same side of this. It's not us against it's not you against me, it's us against OCD.
That's right.
And by that, yeah, I'm not going to participate in this way. And we can have some clear rules that if the fight gets dirty, there's going to be some natural consequences,
Yeah,
whether it's going to the hospital, whether it's, and it's not always to that extreme, but I know it does come up.
it can
And
be.
and it can be certainly because if you think of someone that's perpetually been living in this state of terror, that feeling of hopelessness is very common. And you talked about that too. We've talked about it here on the podcast about comorbidities. Anxiety is obviously a very big one. Depression is a very big one as well. And that feeling of, I think you even put it in the book, hopelessness and helplessness. It's so pervasive in the relationship. And so we add that on to now we're looking at a marriage relationship or partnership. And it's just, even in dating, it can be hell. It really can. And so it's really important to understand that your opponent is not each other. Your opponent is the OCD, and that's for any OCD sufferer, realizing like this is not you, like you're like this terrible person. You're not. This is your brain stuck in this thought loop cycle, and there is a lot of hope available to get out of it and to have some reduction, if not even remission in your symptomology, which is huge. I feel like I don't know, maybe you would know because you've done so much research in the anxiety field at large, but I feel like statistics for OCD treatment and the prognosis is so much higher than what I hear often in anxiety in general for like generalized anxiety or depression. I feel like ERP is really, really effective. And I don't always see we can't always give that information to people coming in. Yeah, well, your depression probably will go away. I don't know if it go away, and it's not that OCD goes away, but we can manage it. We can sit with it. We can thrive, regardless of the fact that you have OCD or not. So, do you know in terms of how this stacks up to some of the other mental health disorders? And I know there are a lot of comorbidities, so it might be just too hard to tell. But ERP is pretty effective. We have some pretty good outcomes for OCD sufferers.
We do. I would say that OCD is among the success stories in the treatment of mental health disorders. And for a long time, over 50 years, we have data, good, data showing that this can be an effective treatment. That said, as I mentioned before, it certainly is not a panacea. It doesn't help everybody. It is challenging to do.
Mhm.
And you need to have a therapist who really gets it and understands how to implement the treatment. It's really tricky because it is so personalized.
Mhm.
Um, Everyone who has OCD has a little bit of their own spin on the problem. They have their obsessions and compulsions are very much linked to their personal values and things that they hold dear.
Mhm.
And so the treatment has to be tailored, to that. And if a therapist doesn't understand all the different presentations of OCD and doesn't have a, good experience working with folks with OCD, that doesn't always go well.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And finding a lot of people walk in and, they might present a relational conflict in a couple session. And I think a lot of therapists with good intentions could say, "Oh, let's work on your, communication and your active listening." And again, those things are not bad. We use those tools certainly within our treatment model as well. But if they miss the point and they end up just reinforcing some of these higher level compulsions, then that's not helpful, right? The therapist can actually reinforce the problem if they don't recognize it as OCD. And I think that is improving, as you had pointed out, but I also think it has a long way to go. And I know that was true for me before I got into the world of OCD. I was like, wow, I've never had a client with OCD. And then I learned more and I went, oh, Nicole, like I can see now where a lot of generalized anxiety, if we kind of go just a little bit deeper, you can see that OCD thought cycle a lot of times in those generalized anxiety cases. And so it's not to say that every case of anxiety is OCD, certainly not. But I do think a lot in treatment, I think a lot of anxiety cases that are OCD can be treated in other ways that don't help address the root problem. So with that, I mean, one of the reasons I started this podcast, I am one of, I am an ERP specialist. If you look up around the area, you could go 100 miles to maybe find another. It's sometimes hard to find access to qualified ERP people. We don't know if we're dealing with OCD sometimes, so we don't even know that we were supposed to find an ERP person or something to that effect. And so I know that can be a challenge. NoCD is a great resource. That's an app that usually has licensed therapists in every state. IOCDF also has a provider search where you can type in your area, and that's worldwide, and you can see who's around you and able to treat. In a day and age of telehealth, there's greater accessibility if you're in the same state where somebody's licensed or in a country, and how that works in individual provinces, I'm not sure, but like it's very, very helpful in this day and age. You are discussing that part of the treatment that you are doing with those older adults, with those couples, similar to SPACE, but SPACE is usually with younger children. Is there a name for the protocol or the program that you work with those couples and the older adults with?
I think it's based no, there's not a name like Light Space or anything like that, but it's based on, it kind of pulls together the principles of exposure and response prevention, the
Hmm.
principles of effective communication, the principles of parenting strategies, and in particular parenting older, kids, although to some extent the same rules that you would use to parent younger kids apply to parenting adults who are living under your roof.
Right.
So, what assertiveness, communication skills, parenting skills, when you pull a lot of these things together, that's, that kind of is what we use when
Yeah.
we're working with these folks. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know with working ERP in a case when we were talking about, you were talking kind of the average 4 months or 16 sessions, a lot of progress can be made. And I know I've worked with so many clients where, often you make kind of a fear hierarchy at the beginning of treatment. And I've talked with the CD family community about at the beginning of treatment, you're going to kind of use your SUD scale to gauge the level of distress you feel with different obsessions, and you identify what compulsions you're going to try and resist and give up in those exposures. But often we get a little bit into treatment, maybe even a month in, and we're like, we need to redo this because the calibration of these really intense things that has sometimes bothered people for decades have drastically shifted, and that's pretty powerful. And so being able to think about that too, even in the dynamic of couples, or if you're an OCD sufferer that, say, has been through many relationships and you're like, I'm just doomed to fail because this is going to play out in every relationship. You're not any more doomed to fail than any of the rest of us. We're all people. We're all just trying to kind of get the hang of this. And there's a lot of hope for you that some of those dynamics can change. So I think it's pretty powerful when you're working with, like, a couple. Would you find something around that same 4-month mark is generally can do a lot to help propel the couple, or what does that course of treatment usually look like on average for you?
Yeah. So we developed and tested a program that was 16 sessions. And the first couple of sessions are assessment and education.
Mhm.
And by the way, this was the first the first 4 weeks were twice a week therapy sessions,
Okay.
right? So that 4 weeks, so that's 8 sessions, and then the next ones were weekly.
Okay.
Right, so 16 sessions. The first 4 weeks were twice a week,
Mhm.
and that's because we're doing a lot of education.
Mhm.
We're teaching the couple communication skills, and then we're introducing exposure and developing the exposure hierarchy or list, and then, introducing exposure. And then we want the couple practicing exposures on their own
Mm.
between sessions more and more, and that's where we space it out to weekly
Mhm.
sessions. And that's really, the first couple of sessions, education, learning communication skills. Then we get into exposure in the session. We teach the couple how to do exposure. And then as we go along, we work more on reducing accommodation, increasing exposure, and kind of passing more and more the work off to the couple to do
Mhm.
between sessions because we want them to become a team. And the therapy sessions are more used as coaching.
Mhm.
Let's hear how it went. Let's problem solve. Let's figure out what you're going to do next, and then you know planning it out with the couple, and the couple executes on their own.
Right. So they're driving the situation, and we're there to kind of help them stay in their lane and make sure that they're working on together in the same lane,
Right.
not going on roundabouts. As OCD loves a good roundabout. But yeah, I think that's a really helpful explanation because sometimes I think people are discouraged to even try treatment because they're like, first of all, can't teach an old dog new tricks. Second of all, I've heard it over and over again. I can't change my partner, so you have to either change you or change it, and you are changing you. You're changing your response to this situation or the thought around the situation rather than the situation.
Yeah.
And that does produce very dramatic change. It can, and it's pretty powerful. It's part of what is so rewarding about doing this work is that we don't need to see these dramatic shifts to know, like, it's worth helping people,
Mhm.
but it's undeniable that this helps, that this brings hope to people, and so knowing that even in 16 weeks, so much can be accomplished
with
is
with hard work,
with hard work.
with hard work, and hard work from the therapist and the person with OCD and the family members. We don't want to gloss over the fact that this is a challenging, for some folks, this is one of the hardest things that they've ever had to do. But, yeah, you put that effort in, and what the research tells us is that you're likely to see some benefit, and very often a lot of benefit. But it
Yeah.
comes with hard work. You have to put in the effort. You have to put into it what you get out of it.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is I think that scares people on at the face value, but again, something that I reiterate is living with OCD for this
That's pretty
long
bad too.
is
Yeah.
pretty hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and feeling tortured by what if I did hurt somebody? What if I'm going, what does this mean about me and getting caught up in that? What about the situation where, we talked about learning how to communicate, actively listen. What about the situation where you have the partner who is like, I don't think this is what's going on with me at all. Screw this. I'm not participating in it. Like, what do you do to help support that person that's like, hey, I love them. I don't want to leave them, but I'm going crazy. Like, what can I do because my partner is treatment resistant either because they're so in such a severe kind of place in their OCD or they're just feeling hopeless at this point.
Yeah, right. And there are people who get to a point where the therapy seems too daunting, and so they feel like I don't want to go through this,
Mhm.
or they're feeling hopeless, right? I don't deserve this, things like that.
Mhm.
And so you're right. If you're in a relationship with someone like that, in a partnership, for example, there are things that you can do to that you don't have to give in, right? Just because your loved one is not doing the therapy doesn't mean that, you have to give in and accommodate the OCD. We cannot force other people to change their behavior. We can't We can't tell other people, well, we can tell other people what we want them to do, but they don't have to listen. And so, yeah, we cannot force. And so instead, we want to focus on our own behavior as the partner of someone who is not engaging in treatment. All we can do is work on our own behavior. And you want to do what's going to be healthy for your loved one with OCD. And as we talked
Mhm.
about before, there is nothing unhealthy about the kind of anxiety that people with OCD have. It's short term, it's not dangerous. There's nothing unhealthy about intrusive thoughts. There's nothing unhealthy about uncertainty. And there's everything healthy about teaching that person by changing your own behavior,
Mhm.
teaching them that they can manage. So, we do encourage people who they have a partner that's unwilling to get help. Well, that means that it's not going to make things easy. But if you're going to stay in this relationship and you don't want to accommodate the OCD, here's what to do. You don't have to accommodate it. I will say that that makes the relationship difficult, right? That's a big ticket item where the couples disagree.
Yeah.
And that can make it really difficult for the relationship to continue if that OCD is, playing a role as a third wheel. That said, there are couples that do manage that way.
Yeah.
Um, there are couples where they've kind of agreed as a couple, okay, this is the amount of OCD we're willing to live with, and here's the boundary of where we're not willing to live with it. So again, that might be something working with a therapist. You're gonna be able to learn communication skills, learn some problem solving and decision making so that you're hopefully working together. But there are times when the person without OCD kind of has to unilaterally say, I've had it up to here with this. I'm not giving in. I love you.
Mhm.
And
And
but
because I love you.
and because I love you, I'm not gonna give in.
Yeah.
And sometimes the person without OCD, that actually helps them and says, well, you know what? You're right. And I can do this and I am going to get help. And then in other cases, it doesn't.
Yeah, it's one of those tricky dynamics because when it happens, like in the parent child relationship, or say, if the child's resistant, but the parent not accommodating is by proxy. And that's kind of what we talk about with space of, you being able to promote that message and make the announcement that you're going to be able to do this. And I haven't given you the opportunity to let you realize you can. So we're going to do that. And that's how it's going to go. That's different than when it's a partner and you're like, "Well, you know what? You may wanna avoid doing this, but I'm not going to participate in the avoidance of this anymore." And that can cause some real tension and real conflict for sure if the OCD sufferer is refusing to really engage in the treatment, but you're also like, "Hey, I'm gonna draw this boundary." Ultimately, though, are you living in the relationship? Are you participating in the relationship? This is something we just recently, not too long ago, discussed relationship OCD on the podcast. And it's like, are you having a relationship in your head or are you engaging in the relationship? It's really tough. So when you have a partner that is not willing to deal with it or is also just maybe stuck, it's not always an issue of I'm willing or not willing. They're terrified. They're stuck being able to sit there and go, okay, what can I do to actually participate in the relationship? If they didn't have OCD, would I take this? I think that's a really good hard and fast rule that we can go back to. Like, would I accept the same behavior in a relationship if they didn't have OCD?
Yeah.
So I really like that hard and fast rule. Well, this has been very, very helpful. Thank you so much for taking the time to
Uh,
discuss
I,
family and children, parents, partners, all of that. It's tricky work, but it's very, very rewarding, not only as a therapist, but, just it's can't be said enough for people out there suffering or seeing their loved ones suffering. There's a lot of hope available. And yes, this may not work for everyone, but it works for a lot of people. And also, I should probably mention that there's going to be different times, because for any of us, where we're going to be more open and receptive to something, and things can change, right? That's malleable. Like we can not be ready to face something now, and in 2 years, okay, we're going to do this. I'm going to do it. And so,
that's true.
even if it's right now, It feels like, nope, we're not going to do treatment. That doesn't mean it will always stay that way. And you as the loved one have a lot more ability to speak into the situation or not speak into the situation and institute some change. So that's really empowering, I think.
True. I
Yeah.
couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you so much. The book that we've talked about, The Family Guide to Getting Over OCD, Reclaim Your Life and Help Your Loved One, is so perfect for our community. And so I'm going to also provide more of that information on this episode's blog post where you can find out more information about Jon. You can learn more about ERP. You can find a link to his book and everything else. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. And
Pleasure.
I appreciate your time, and hey, I would love to talk again at some point in the future, I'm sure, as
Sounds good.
studies, research, everything continues to gain traction. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Sure thing, Nicole. Thanks for again for having me.
Absolutely. Anytime. Anytime, Jon.
All right.
Intrusive thoughts. Okay, so I just have to say, I'm so honored to be able to hold this space for these important conversations with you all. When I dreamed about creating this community, I brainstormed so many aspects of what could be helpful, what resources are available, support, and dream guests. My behavioral therapy training institute certification, yeah, say that 3 times fast, expanded my network with amazing colleagues and researchers in the OCD field. And I was optimistic with regards to how I could coordinate bringing these important voices together to help the OCD family community. But still, I've been blown away by the graciousness of my guests. And when I found the family guide to getting over OCD, already knowing and trusting the amazing work that Jon has done, in addition to checking all the boxes of what this podcast is trying to support, I just decided to reach out on a whim and ask if he would be willing to take a seat at our peripheral family table. And I have to say, I'm so glad I risked being vulnerable and trying something new because here I am wrapping up the second of 2 dynamic episodes. And it really emphasizes the fact that we are not alone in this fight. And whether you're a person with lived experience, a family member, a partner, a clinician, a researcher, we are better together. Even if you're completely new and have no direct experience with OCD in any of these capacities, the reality that you're here and showing up makes this community stronger. It's important to learn about what we don't know, and your willingness to walk alongside us is cherished and seen. So thank you. And so for my application point for today, it's simply this: try something new. I've never done a podcast before, but I created one anyway. I'm not a techie person, but I've quickly learned, I like to think, how to record audio, edit sound waves, build a website, integrate plugins, you name it. Dare I admit, I didn't even have a TikTok account, and now I'm creating them, let alone running Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to dish out our OCD family goodness. But I tried it, and I'm still trying it. And I'm pretty sure there are things we can point to in our own lives that are worth giving a shot. Maybe it's a new hobby or an endeavor that you've really wanted to start, but fear of failure has kept you from trying. Maybe it's trying ERP or supporting your loved one in their therapy, even though it's scary. Maybe it's following through and enduring the distress that inevitably surfaces when we stop engaging in our loved one's compulsions. It's okay to say, not today, and that's okay. The distress is not fun, but it won't harm you. It won't harm your loved ones. And while I know some days probably feel like it is just not worth the fight, the trouble to go against the grain, or to try something new, you never know what kindness, support, or help might find you on the other side. And hey, will it work? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But you'll never know if you don't try. So go ahead. You've got this. We've got this. And we are better together. Thank you for joining me and our OCD family community. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please like and subscribe to the OCD Family Podcast wherever you enjoy your podcasts. Did you find this content helpful? Please consider leaving a review. The more people that know they're not alone, the better. For more information regarding today's podcast, please visit ocdfamilypodcast.com and remember to join the email list while you're there. It will provide you with the most up-to-date information, resources, and the down low on the family chatter. Oh yeah, nothing says family like working through our miscommunication. That's right, I went there. And you can too at ocdfamilypodcast.com.